Hey everybody, welcome to Dad's Den of Pop Culture. So how many of you have seen Rocky Jones, Space Ranger? Yeah, that's kind of from the opening. A really interesting sci-fi show from the early 50s, premiered in 1954, in fact, from Roland Reed Productions. It's a kid's show, but it has a foundation to it that it could have actually been more adult, say like Star Trek. And in fact, even though I don't know of any connection whatsoever between Rocky Jones and Star Trek, there's a lot about it that seemed to foreshadow Star Trek more than a decade later. If you're a fan of original Star Trek, this might be a show you want to check out. It was released in syndication, 39 episodes. Most of them are 3-part stories. And the reason they did that was because they would be able to go back and repackage those as short films that they could probably release in Saturday afternoon matinee for kids, which they did. In fact, the first time I ever saw Rocky Jones was in a Mystery Science Theater. Doing they actually, and I think they actually did 2 of them, but doing one of those movies. So really kind of an ingenious idea. So let's roll through some images from the first episode, which would be the first part of a 3-part story. So we're not going to have any real spoilers here. So our hero, Rocky Jones, is played by Richard Crane. He got started in the business in 1940, did a lot of B movies, did a lot of TV. In fact, plays an astronaut in an episode of Men into Space, which is another one of those shows that, to me, kind of feeds into the sci-fi concepts that would lead to Star Trek. And he does a good job as Rocky Jones. Rocky Jones is very much the stalwart sort of hero, has a little bit of a sense of humor, maybe not as personable as Captain Kirk, but he does okay. We begin the episode with a view of Earth. Not a cloud in the sky. It's one of the nicest days ever. And an approaching spaceship. Now, one of the highlights of Rocky Jones is the special effects, which for the time on television are pretty darn good. Rocky Jones, unlike a lot of the sci-fi for kids at the time, which was done sort of live, you get some kinetoscopes. Essentially a kinetoscope was like a camera filming a monitor that was showing what was being done live. So not a lot of it survives from like Space Patrol and Tom Corbett Space Cadet. Rocky Jones was shot on film. So we have all 39 episodes of the show, which is really cool. And I think that helped them as well with some of their special effects, with them being, a little bit better than maybe some of these other shows. So what we're seeing here is the spaceship of Rocky Jones, the XV-2, called the Orbit Jet. Now, later in the series, the Orbit Jet will be destroyed, and it will be replaced with the XV-3, called the Silver Moon. So there actually is some continuity in the series, which is one of the things I like. And the V2 does, the V2 part of XV-2 does refer to the V2 rockets from World War II, since that was kind of the standard for rocketry at the time. It is the post-World War II era. A lot of the ideas in this show sort of stem from the ideas that were current in not NASA, it wasn't NASA yet, but in the space program that we had, the idea of space wheels, i.e., space stations, the idea of rockets that would, land on, the bottom, etc. That's kind of what was current at the time, and that's what you get in this show. The crew of the Orbit Jet, Rocky Jones there, and his sidekick, Winky. Winky was played by Scotty Beckett, and of course, have to mention Scotty Beckett was from the Hal Roach Our Gang comedies as Scotty. And like many of the kids in those, that were involved in show business back in the day, he had a rough end to his life. And in fact, one of those things that he did led to him being essentially dropped from the show, because I think he had to maybe go to jail, and he would end up getting replaced by another character. So sad, but he does a good job as Winky. A lot of charisma, a lot of energy. So it was actually really kind of sad seeing the character have to leave the show. And in fact, you can read more about what happened with Scotty and a few other good tidbits on the show in an old issue of Filmfax magazine, where they cover Rocky Jones, Space Ranger. It was useful. Some good insights. If you're interested in, it sounds funny, this is a magazine from the 1990s that primarily covers entertainment from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, into the 60s, into the 70s a little bit. If you're interested in that era and you can find old issues of Filmfax, grab them if you can, if you can afford them. There's a lot of good stuff. I loved this magazine back in the day. Big part of my my retro education about all this stuff. Also great advertisements for old videotapes. Anyways, so Rocky and Winky are talking on their video phone to Secretary Drake, played by Charles Meredith. He is the head of the Office of Space Affairs and essentially the commander of the Space Rangers, who are like a peacekeeping force through the solar system. The solar system, not all of it, but a lot of it is organized as the United Worlds of the solar system. Think of that as being sort of like the United Nations. All the worlds are independent, but they kind of work together for their mutual benefit. So we get some shots of the landing area, which I think is like actually a power station. Drake heads out of headquarters to meet Rocky and Winky. They have been on a long mission and are looking forward to some R&R. Here we see the rocket ship as it's landing, kind of descends. Again, pretty good special effect. Of course, the idea of rocket ships, landing like that is, of course, really out of date and completely old-fashioned, and has completely been usurped by the idea of space shuttles. So here's Secretary Drake. Kind of see his little uniform, and you see on his breast there the emblem of the Space Rangers. Behind him, you can't see it well in this shot. You have headquarters of the Space Rangers. There was a little emblem there too. I think it shows up on the caps that they wear, and they did sell those. There was a fair amount of merchandising for Rocky Jones. There was a comic book, and I do have some reprints. I'm going to show those off in another video one of these days. There were coloring books, a few things. The show was not as popular as Space Patrol, and it didn't sell as well as Space Patrol, even though I think, frankly, it's a better show. So the landing finished. They roll a gantry out to the rocket. It helps ground the thing, which is good because the science in Rocky Jones is pretty sloppy. And you can see there Winky climbing down the gantry. Rocky has already landed. They're in sort of the dress uniforms there. As I said, with Star Trek, they hired somebody from, I believe, the Rand Company Corporation to sort of check the work of the writers as far as, does this make sense scientifically? They didn't have that on Rocky Jones, so you get some misuses of terms. You get a lot of inhabited planets in the solar system, probably more than there should be, although with several of them, they do look like the people live underground, which I guess makes a little bit more sense. But yeah, it doesn't have rigorous scientific accuracy, but you do get things like the gantry, and you get an idea of the scale of the ships and all that, which is pretty cool. So the landing having been effected, you could see here the dress uniforms of the Space Rangers. The uniforms had sort of a dark bluish gray and a white. You can see the emblems there. You can also, on Winky's sleeve, you can see the stripe. He had one stripe. Rocky has three. So you get into a sense of rank. And that's, again, you kind of get this, there's some thought that's gone into this thing. They're not just like repurposed Air Force uniforms. They have more uniformity than a lot of the kids' sci-fi at the time. So I really like the attention that went into some of this stuff for this show. There's also, to me, they're a little bit reminiscent of the dress uniforms from Star Trek The Motion Picture. I know it's not an exact duplicate or anything, but I remember the first time I saw them, that's what popped into my head was Kirk in that uniform. So while Rocky and Winky are heading into headquarters, Drake has a visit from a very impatient Vina Ray, who's played by Sally Mansfield. She will be one of the principal characters, one of the principal crew members in the show. And, you know, it's been said that Forbidden Planet, which was released a couple years after this, introduced the miniskirt to the American people. Vina Ray's got a pretty short skirt there, so I'm not entirely sure that's true. Maybe Sally Mansfield should get some credit that has heretofore gone to Anne Francis. So Vina Ray has brought what she thinks is evidence that the defection of Professor Newton, who's played by Maurice Cass, and his ward, Bobby, played by Robert Lydon, might not be genuine. Now, they have supposedly defected to the planet Ophiuchus. And Ophiuchus is sort of like the Soviet Union to Rocky Jones and the United Worlds USA. They're the bad guys. You can see they got the other different uniforms there, and they're fancier, etc. And so this is a really serious allegation. And so Drake decides to send Rocky and Winky to Ophiuchus to investigate. So no R&R for these two, after all. And all the while, they're being watched by Ranger Griff. Very suspiciously. I wonder what could be up there. So the Ophiuchians, from Ranger Griff, learn that Rocky is headed that way. So they send a spaceship out to intercept. And you'll notice different design from the United World spaceship. So again, I like the detail here. It's pretty cool. It operates more or less the same way, and it might have a very similar control room as well. Look, budget's always an issue on these things, especially in the 1950s. And so in this shot, you get a better look at the uniforms on the Ophiuchians. They're black. They're a little more overblown, like you would expect from totalitarians. So these guys are kind of the Klingons, of the series, and are going to clash with Rocky several times. Back at headquarters, they're planning their trip, and Vina makes it known that she wants to go along because, she has a connection to Professor Newton and Bobby. She knows several languages, including Ophiuchian, which they're going to need, and she is a licensed navigator. And Rocky isn't real happy about having a woman aboard the orbit jet. Drake says, nope, she's going, gives the okay. So, a decade before Uhura, we have Vina Ray helping break ground for women in sci-fi. And not, again, just playing a damsel in distress all the time. She's actually contributing, she's ultimately accepted into the crew as, one of the gang, even though Rocky kind of begins a little bit iffy about it. It is 1954 after all. So Drake wishes them luck as they prepare to launch. And then we get the launch sequence, the gantry moving over. And we also get this guy who has to power up the orbit jet. And there's this sort of and they're calling it like we have to synchronize. It's iffy what kind of science is involved here. It involves a loud noise. And it probably also, more importantly, involved a sequence that could be inserted into an episode to take up some time, because that's always an issue in these kind of TV shows. And so on the ship, Rocky has Vina strap in for the launch. That's Winky, I believe, and he'll be going into the cockpit with Rocky. So the orbit jet, what we see of it are three rooms. There's the cockpit. There's this room right next to it, which has these reclining chairs for takeoffs. And there is like a desk there for the navigator. And then next to that, you have another room, has like this large pipe going through it. So you get a feeling it's some sort of mechanical maintenance sort of room. It's never 100% clear what's going on in these things. And speaking of the cockpit, here we have those two strapped in, ready for launch. You get some random sci-fi sort of, gadgets and all that kind of good stuff that you expect from 50 sci-fi. Once they're outside of Earth's gravity, their own artificial gravity is turned on, and then Vina gets to work navigating. And of course, we're in the computer age, but we're also in the pre-computer age. And so it's all being done on paper with, pencils and all that kind of good stuff. And so later we see Rocky and Winky have gotten out of the dress uniforms. They're in sort of, I guess you can call them their duty uniforms, sort of a white short sleeve sweater. They have a cap on. They sometimes will put a jacket on as well. Looks like it's that dark blue-gray color of the other uniforms. When you look at the uniforms, they're not terribly different from what you get on Star Trek, especially the pilot. A sort of sweater with the emblem on the breast. They don't have hats on, but there is a hat that shows up in Pike's quarters, though. So, again, one kind of reminds me of the other, but I think what it really shows is there's this sort of continuity of what things are going to look like that exists in the 50s and through the 60s and is going to start to get broken up by the introduction of Star Wars, but also I think by the introduction of, the space shuttle. A space shuttle really energized people in the 80s after the original moon launches. And you start seeing more of the jumpsuit kind of concept that we get from real astronauts. So those things kind of broke it up. But there used to be a kind of continuity to the ideas of what some of this stuff was going to actually look like. And of course, Rocky's still not real thrilled about having a woman on the orbit jet. Vina gives as well as she gets, though. There's a little back and forth between the two of them. And you see, Rocky's kind of like, he's not super serious about it. He's not like angry or anything like that. Kind of enjoys the back and forth that they have. Here's a nice shot of the orbit jet in flight. And at this point, they get a radar contact. And we see Vina reacting to the danger, to the alarm that kind of goes off. And the contact, of course, turns out to be the Ophesian ship. And so here we're going to get a sort of a dogfight in space. Now, if you're expecting something like you'd get from Star Wars, you're going to be very disappointed. It's not quite as good as that, but we do see the ships actually maneuvering around a little. Unlike Star Trek, but like most of the sci-fi from this period, Rocky Jones really patterns the ships and what they were going to do more off of the Air Force and its jet planes than on naval vessels. That's in some ways, you'd get that in sci-fi stories, but that was kind of really brought to the popular imagination, I think, mostly by Star Trek. So this is more like the Air Force, and in fact, the Air Force is sort of the pattern of the U.S. Space Force. So they weren't really that off. So the Ophesians try to destroy the orbit jet. They miss ultimately. And so Rocky manages to maneuver behind them. They get the ship in their sights, launch a missile, and manage to cripple, but not destroy, the Ophesian ship. I do like the fact that in Rocky Jones, again, kind of like Star Trek, the purpose is not always just let's destroy everything. I know a lot of people characterize Kirk as like a space cowboy. He really isn't if you actually watch the series and pay attention to it. And Rocky Jones isn't either. They cripple the ship, that's enough, that gets them off our back and we can continue on. But one of the explosions of an Ophesian missile does apparently put a small hole in the hull of the orbit jet. And so there's that third room I was talking about. So Rocky goes in to inspect. Here's the air rushing out. So he rushes to the cockpit to seal this room off so they don't have a major problem. While he's doing that, Vina gets up and goes in to investigate, and that's when the door seals and closes. So after a few minutes, maybe probably more like a few seconds, Winky notices Vina's absence, and they realize that she has been sealed in that chamber, which is rapidly being depleted of oxygen, and in fact, she's fallen unconscious in there. So Rocky gets like some cutting tools to cut a hole through the door, manages to get her out of there. And I know some people go, oh, the damsel in distress. No, this is like an accident. She's not as used to the procedures aboard these ships. And Rocky didn't tell her what he was doing. It's just an accident. But the ship being damaged they're going to have to go ahead and make 4 repairs at a space station. You see here the oxygen sort of helmets they have. We really don't see them in full, like, spacesuits, generally speaking. Aboard ship, they'll do a magnetic lock, and they'll open the doors between the ships, but they'll sometimes wear the helmet just the same. But a little clunky. They're not too bad, though. And so the space station OW9 is sort of that wheel in space concept. And the space station is crewed by Ranger Clark, played by William Hudson. Each of these space stations seems to have like one crewman aboard to handle everything. So we get this landing procedure on the space station, and Rocky's letting them know, we got some damage to the ship. We're going to need repairs. And here you see they have sort of like this, these tubes on top, and the spaceship sort of flies into the tube. Apparently that's, seals it so they can get out and walk around without dying, which is really, really handy in space. And again, the concept of building a space station like this was fundamental to the early ideas of how we were going to get to the moon. So in that respect, pretty good science fiction accuracy there. Like the nuts and bolts of how things were believed they were going to be working in the future. So that ends the first part of this story. Directed by Hollingsworth Morse. He does most of the direction through the series. He had worked also on Lone Ranger, Zorro, Adam 12, H.R. Puffin stuff, Dukes of Hazzard, Fall Guy. In other words, not a specialist in sci-fi. And it doesn't appear that anybody who worked on this really had a lot of experience in science fiction. I think that Roland Reed saw an opportunity to get into the space business, and they actually made a pretty good show as a result. And there we see our cast: Scotty Beckett, Sally Mansfield, Robert Lydon, Maurice Cass, Leonard Penn, Charles Meredith, Frank Pulaski, Bill Hudson. Director of photography, Walter String. Again, he'd been in the business for a long time, not really in sci-fi. Same with the rest of the people there. Photographic effects, Jack R. Glass. I want to call that out because he did such a good job with it. Now, he did do some sci-fi movies. What was it? The Man from Planet X, The Magnetic Monster, Project Moonbase, which is actually not a bad little movie, but he mostly worked in stuff like The Great Gildersleeve, The Life of Riley. He did Adventures of Superman. He did Steve Canyon, which I reviewed on this channel a while back. So did a lot of stuff. And I think that's one of the things that kind of helps with this show, is that you get outsiders. These are not people that are absolutely steeped in science fiction, and they can bring a lot to a genre, provided they approach it with respect, which these guys really, in my opinion, did. And so they were the executive producer, associate producer, Arthur Pearson. So I'm not going to go through the other 2 episodes in this first story, and I don't want to spoil things for you. I will throw the spoiler sign up, though, for just a moment, because I do want to talk about, the remainder of the story, just a tiny bit, and also some of the additional episodes of the series. So ultimately, in this first storyline, we do meet Queen Cleolanta, Queen Cleolanta of Ophiuchus, played by Patsy Parsons, does a great job as the sort of evil queen, berating her men for their failures and all that kind of stuff. Has a little bit of something for Rocky Jones. And naturally, it is revealed that Professor Newton and Bobby were hypnotized into defecting, and they managed to solve the problem and get them back home to Earth where they belong. The next major story in the series is Bobby's Comet. Now, apparently, some of the footage from the first episode of Bobby's Comet was part of the pilot episode done for Rocky Jones, which was filmed in 1951. Now, they ultimately changed the casting of Secretary Drake and Vina Ray, but I'm also thinking 3 years earlier, Bobby's going to be a lot younger. I mean, he's a kid. 3 years makes a big difference. So I'm not sure how much of the pilot actually managed to make it into Bobby's Comet. But in this one, you do get to see another inhabited planet. Well, in this case, actually, apparently a moon of Jupiter called Fornax, that kind of contacts Earth by sending a missile there. It's kind of an odd situation. When they get there, there's this giant building. There's a little bit of like this Egyptian vibe to the people of Fornax. Now they end up being friendly, and they will show up in a couple other episodes. So again, showing that there was some continuity to Rocky Jones. Rocky's Odyssey is the next one. Kind of an important story. It introduces the twin gypsy moons, meaning like rogue moons that don't orbit anything per se, or kind of cross the orbit of other planets, called Nagato and Posita, or Posito, maybe Posito, at any rate. These moons have an atmosphere, and the atmosphere actually connects the two moons, and they're in a state of hostility that has them not only hating one another, but hostile to all outsiders. John Banner, famous as Sergeant Schultz of Hogan's Heroes, plays Bavaro, the ruler of Posita, in this one. And again, this shows to me the similarity in Star Trek, where it's not a matter of Rocky trying to beat the crap out of everybody. It's a matter of, well, how do we solve this problem? How do we solve the hostilities between these two worlds, and also manage to avoid, injury or capture by these people? A few of the episodes in Rocky Jones, I think with a little work, could be made into sort of like Star Trek episodes. They could have been made a little bit more adult. The Pirates of Pra, to me, is notable for this concept they have of cold light. This is an invention of Professor Newton. The science explanation is iffy at best, but essentially cold light. So you know how heat can create mirages, right? Well, cold light can do the opposite, which is make things invisible. So essentially, equipped with cold light, the orbit jet gets a cloaking device. And that's why you can see in this shot, Rocky is sort of stepping out on this platform, apparently from nothing. Well, it's actually the orbit jet that's invisible. So a cool concept. And, again, it's one of those nice things that will show up later on in Star Trek. These guys they were thinking. Silver Needle in the Sky, interesting one. You get a group of ambassadors from the United Worlds meeting on Space Station X07. And this is where, and you can kind of see in that shot, another Fornaxian shows up here. The Ophicians ultimately show up, try to kidnap everybody. But again, the meeting of ambassadors kind of reminds me of Journey to Babel. Crash of Moons sees Ophiuchus destroyed by a collision with Posita. So, like I said, Nagato, Posita are rogue moons. They don't follow a normal orbital path, and they end up crashing into Ophiuchus and destroy it. And so the episodes involve Rocky and his crew trying to convince Cleolanta to abandon the planet because there's nothing they can do to save them. The United Worlds wants, again, even though Ophiuchus is the enemy, United Worlds wants to get as many people off as possible. Well, everybody, if possible. Cleolanta doesn't want to go. Ultimately, one of her henchmen says, you know what? I'm not letting you die here. We need our queen. Grabs her, forces her onto the spaceship to get off of the planet. It's a really good episode. It's smart in its way. Again, it's a kid's episode, but interesting ideas about what actually makes a people. Is it the land they live on, or is it sort of the culture that they share? So a smart episode, one I like. Now, Blast Off is the final story for Winky. He would be leaving the series after this. And it's, to me, the episode that reminded me most of something you'd get on Star Trek. I think they suffer damage and they have to land on an unexplored planetoid. And they find these people that are sort of like a, primitive tribal level. There's like hill people and valley people who have been at war, and they finally are coming together, and Rocky sort of gets in the way accidentally. What I thought was really interesting is the people recognized him, that apparently sometime in the past, a visitor had come from space who resembled Rocky Jones. And so that one felt kind of Star Trek-y to me. And ultimately, this is also where we get the destruction of the orbit jet by a guy who's jealous, thinks that Rocky is stealing the princess that he wants to marry. And Rocky and them have to finally get off the planet by repairing the sort of flying saucer-like spaceship that the earlier visitor had left behind. A lot of neat concepts in that one. I really enjoyed it. The Cold Sun is we get our replacement for Winky, which is a character called Biffen Cardoza from the planet of Herculon. So he's kind of like an exchange officer. They usually just call him Biff. He's played by James Lydon, yes, related to Bobby Lydon, I believe. Herculon used to be hostile to the United Worlds. It's now an ally under the suzerain Juliandra. Her father had apparently been the problem. Juliandra's played by Anne Robinson. We lose Cleolanta, we gain Juliandra. And what I thought was interesting too is we eventually kind of figure out that Herculon is outside of the solar system. So they definitely have sort of like a faster than light travel. But they're a little vague on a lot of that stuff. The later storyline, Inferno in Space, has like these energy particles bombarding Earth, destroying all wood on the planet, which is goofy. But in that one, they have to go to Herculon and use that as a jumping off point to get to the planet where the problem actually is. We also get an evil twin for Juliandra called, I think Noviandra was. Interesting one. We see our first robot in that storyline as well. The last major storyline from the series is the trial of Rocky Jones, which reintroduces some of the enemies that he had earlier in the series, including the great Pinto Vortando, who's absolutely 100% nuts, but I love it. And it kind of wraps the series up really nicely. So Rocky Jones does sort of get a finale rather than it just being sort of cut off, in a midpoint. So Rocky Jones, Space Ranger, all in all, it's a show for kids, but I think it has enough to offer adults, especially if you're a Star Trek fan or a fan of 50s sci-fi. You should give it a look. You should give it a watch. There's a lot of clever concepts on the show. There's neat continuity. And you could definitely see, with more money and maybe a decade later, this is sort of a blueprint for what we get with Star Trek. And definitely worth watching. Hey, let me know what you think. Have you seen Rocky Jones? Do you want to see Rocky Jones? Do you have any questions? Throw it in the comments. I would love to chat with you about the show there. If you enjoyed this review, please hit like, maybe subscribe, share with a friend. In the meantime, God bless everybody. Please be kind to one another. Have a little bit of fun out there and take some time out to watch Rocky Jones, Space Ranger. I'll see you hopefully soon again in Dad's Den of Pop Culture. Bye-bye.